Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Nasser Rabbat, and I'm the director of the Ayakhan program here at MIT. Welcome to our third lecture of the semester with my colleague, Professor Patricia Blessing. Before I let Kat McNally present our guest speaker, I just want to make a few announcements. The first is that I no longer read the land acknowledgement statements, and for reasons that have to do with the fact that they actually make no sense. The second is we have a fourth lecture coming up with our own postdoc, Roberto Fabri, who's sitting there, and that's in April 29th. The title is Nomadic Narratives, Architectural Transplants. This is going to be in this room. But we have added another activity this semester, this Friday, which is basically a presentation of a new series of books that are coming out of Beirut on contemporary architects in the Arab world. So we have the publisher, the editor, and myself speaking in a workshop form in the Stata room, which is what's the building number? Room 7338, Friday between 3 and 6. And to lure more of you to come in, we're bringing very nice sweets on Friday. So you can come and have the food and leave if you want, but do come at 3. We sort of found this caterer that really, very amazing sweets it seems. So Friday at 3 if you have the time. And if anyone wants to take this one copy that I have of the announcement, please feel free. And now to the main event, and Kat will present Patricia.
All right, is this how it works?
You just put it to your lap or something.
I'll just hold it up. So I'm very stoked today for this lecture. I've been looking forward to this lecture for the whole semester. Dr. Patricia Blessing, she's an academic role model of mine, so I'm really excited, and it's my pleasure to introduce her as our speaker for the Aga Khan Spring 2024 lecture series this evening. An associate professor of art history at Stanford University, Dr. Blessing specializes in the art and architecture of the medieval Islamic world with a focus on the Eastern Mediterranean. Similar in scope to our own Dr. Nasser Rabat, but with a geographical orientation towards the Anatolian Plateau, her scholarship demonstrates a deep understanding of the politics of materiality associated to the sensorial experience attached to objects both monumental and miniature. Tonight, she will lead us through her current book project, Spaces of Artifice, Interiors and Environment in Islamic Architecture. This latest work investigates the role of environmental engineering in the design of interior spaces. Dr. Blessing's exploration on the relationship between architecture and climate through the medium of water relates to HTC's own Caroline Murphy, highlighting the versatility of an eco-critical approach towards the built environment across both time, place, and scale. So Dr. Blessing is author of numerous monographs. There's too many to mention, but most recently, Architecture and Material Politics in the 15th Century Ottoman Empire, which was published in 2022, which I must mention she managed to publish with having a newborn. So that's really, that is superhero feat in my mind. Not only these monographs, she has numerous edited volumes, catalogs, and articles as well under her name. Her work has been supported by the Ahmed Research Center for Anatolian Cultures at Koç University, the Barakat Trust, the British Academy, the Gerda Henkel Foundation, the International Center of Medieval Art, the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, and the Society of Architectural Historians. Before Stanford, Dr. Blessing taught at both Pomona College and Princeton University, where she received her Ph.D. She was also, in her limited free time, I don't know how you have free time to do it all, but she's also the managing editor of the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. So please finally join me in giving a warm welcome to the inimitable Dr. Patricia Blessing.
Thank you, Kat, for the very kind introduction, and thank you, Nasser, for inviting me to speak here today, and thank you, Diana, for organizing everything so smoothly, and thanks everyone for coming today. It's a real pleasure to be here. So, sorry, I'm just gonna get the staple out of here because otherwise it's gonna be too annoying. Here we go. Today, I will present materials for my current book project, Spaces of Artifice, Interiors and the Environment in Islamic Architecture. This project is very much work in progress. Here, you see some of the themes I will be exploring today and as I continue my research. The stakes of the project are twofold, in that it engages in a study of multi-sensory perception of interior spaces, and through the presence of water in different types of pre-modern buildings in the Islamic world, proposes an eco-critical approach to these spaces. Focusing on examples in the Eastern Mediterranean built between the 13th and the 16th centuries, this talk analyzes how interior spaces were designed in relationship to nature, with an emphasis on water. While gardens within the Islamic world have been studied in detail, less attention has been devoted to the ways in which nature is allowed to permeate buildings and how it becomes part of interiors. For instance, buildings often contain water features such as fountains and basins, both indoors and in liminal courtyard spaces, supplied by aqueducts, cisterns, and open domes that allow rain and snow to enter. Overall, in textual sources and architectural manifestations of water, there appears to be a preference for running rather than stagnant water. Running water, whether natural or engineered to be such, brings with it sound and hence a move towards the multisensory. Water also has a haptic potential as its presence in a space affects humidity and temperature, aspects that the human body is attuned to feel. Furthermore, water harbors the potential for danger. Storms bring excess of water. The sea always is a looming danger for those who explore it, and water supplies for drinking can be polluted. To the genealogy of this project. I've looked at water in some of my previous work, most closely in an article on multi-sensory perception of the so-called Alhambra vases and their relationship to the palaces of the Alhambra, all created under the rule of the Nasrids in Granada in the 13th and 14th centuries. Water is a central theme in the Alhambra and appears frequently in the poetry that glosses the building and also, for instance, the fountain in the Courtyard of Lions. Branching out from that publication, I recorded a video on water and sound in Islamic architecture in early 2021 for Khamsin Islamic Art History Online, a project created by Christian Gruber at the University of Michigan during the COVID-19 pandemic in response to the until then near total absence of online resources to teach in our field. Intellectually stimulating as recording the video was, I also saw the contents as a minor sideline of my work, perhaps also because I was busy completing my book on Ottoman architecture that Kat just mentioned, which was published in fall 2022. Although, admittedly, water keeps up cropping in that book as well, and some of the material I'll show you today is also discussed in the book. In fall 2021, I began working on a new project in earnest while the book was in production. I began to explore the question of interiors and how they were furnished, and the extent to which it might be possible to reconstruct how spaces looked with original objects in place. The main consideration here was that many such spaces have either changed their function, such as palaces turned museum, Topkapı Palace, the Alhambra, or the Ibrahim Pasha Palace in Istanbul that you see on the slide, or are furnished mostly with modern objects, such as the many mosques that retain their original function, but not the objects that came with it. Eventually, over the course of several months, actually more than a year, I should say, of research in that direction, issues that had been in my mind as potential challenges indeed became obstacles. The historical mobility of objects between buildings meant that objects could be transported from one place to the next with ease and often. Even objects inscribed as having been made from one building could be found in another, which obviously comes to no surprise to any art historian, but it was really sort of one of the sticking points. that I had not thought about sufficiently. An example, a pair of large candlesticks made for the late 15th century mosque of Ottoman Sultan Bayezid II in Edirne, as the large Arabic inscription on the base notes, were moved to the predecessor of what is now the Museum of Turkish and Islamic Art in Istanbul in 1911. But they were found in the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, completed in 1575. It is not clear when they had been moved there. Of course, that could have happened any time between that mosque completion in the late 16th century and 1911. And what to do about the thousands of objects in museums all over the world that have little or no provenance? Further, in a context like that of the Ottoman Empire, where interiors, especially in residential context, were frequently redecorated, is understanding these extremely ephemeral interiors even meaningful? Can we fix them in time? Consider that Guru Necipoglu notes, quote, it, referring to Topkapi Palace, quote, its unchanging structural skeleton embodied an Ottoman language of imperial power, end of quote. Here, the structure and the silhouette, rather than the objects that fill it, carry the monument's meaning. The skeleton then is filled with changing objects and surface decoration, but it also does not exist in a vacuum, but rather within an urban and natural environment, both of which affect the ways in which the monument is experienced, inside and out. So I found myself with the question of the ties between interior and exterior, between environment and built space. As an inroad, an old friend emerged, water in architecture. With its pervasive presence in Islamic architecture, water is an ideal conduit to examine architecture and environment. Eco-architecture, what is interior, what is exterior. As I began to examine these questions, I have also begun to work my way through eco-art histories and the relationship between architecture and climate, and I'll I think, subject our graduate students to some of these explorations next year. Such work is only beginning to emerge in Islamic art history, and I have been inspired, among others, by Sugata Rai's eco-critical approach to early modern South Asia, Ömür Harmanshah's study of Hittite landscape monuments in Anatolia, and Andrew Patricia's conceptual frameworks. As Patricia notes, quote, might art historians, especially the many who have spent lives devoted to the arts created around Mediterranean cultures, be more willing to accept climate as shaping the arts of a region in a more adventurous way, where they close the gap between natural and human histories, end of quote. I will certainly attempt to do so in this project, while also recognizing that there is not one Mediterranean climate, but rather a wide range of microclimates in the broader region, with considerable variation, among other things, between inland and coastal sites. Now, on to water. The examples that follow examine some of the aspects that will be central to the project. First, let me turn to the Mosque Zawiya of Mehmet I in Bursa, a building that I previously examined with a view on construction practices and style in the emerging Ottoman Empire, but which also raises questions of water and climate, especially as it is in a region that does get snow and winter. The building was created in a period when within the growing Ottoman Empire there was a strong emphasis on multifunctional buildings that could house travelers, including Sufis, who played a central role in this period, as well as serve as mosques. And so here, really, originally only this part of the building served as a mosque. These side rooms could serve for teaching, but also lodging. And this covered space was essentially a covered courtyard, which is now that's no longer the case. In the side rooms, for instance, fireplaces were installed to provide heating for lodgers. At the same time, As Veronica Poyer argues in a dissertation recently completed at Harvard, water features in balconies on the upper level of the two-storied portal facade could have served as cooling devices in hot summers. Thus, the monument points to the importance of considering local climatic conditions in assessing buildings. In a region like Western Anatolia, harsh winters and hot summers are to be considered. The region's climate is very different from that of the Arabian Peninsula in which Islam emerged, and the climate of which has led to assumptions about the importance of Islam being tied to the aridity of its birthplace. And this probably sounds like a awful Orientalist commonplace, and it largely also is, and unfortunately still appears oftentimes when the words water and Islamic architecture are being taken together. Back to Bursa. Beginning in the second quarter of the 16th century, as the Ottoman Empire's religious landscape changed, this and many similar buildings were transformed into Friday mosques. As Çiğdem Kafesçioğlu notes, a court record dated 1552 includes a request for the fountain to be removed from the building. The petitioners argue that overflow from the fountain threatened to pollute what was now part of the prayer hall following the building's transformation into a Friday mosque, so that now essentially all of this is also considered mosque space and not only the original part up here. The request for a removal, eventually not carried out, proves that there was indeed a fountain within the building at that time, and likely since the building's inception. But the request also points to important observations about what is considered indoor or outdoor space, or whether the section that contains the fountain was considered a covered courtyard, or rather, as today, and probably again since the 16th century, part of the prayer hall. This discussion points to larger issues of the building's relationship to the environment and presents water as a substance that, especially when turned into a stagnant pool, can also be polluting. Originally, most likely, the courtyard would have been paved and free of carpets, whereas the Ivan containing the mihrab would have been carpeted because of its function as a prayer room. For as long as the fountain was in a space considered to be a courtyard, it might have served for ablutions, although we don't have any records of that. The dome over the courtyard originally was probably open, so there is the question of whether the fountain basin could also have been fed from the outside, although that through rainwater, although here the connection is probably more symbolic than practical. That such a permeable barrier between buildings' interiors and the environment was intentional, and that rainwater could indeed have entered, is apparent at the mausoleum of Ottoman Sultan Murad II, built after his death in 1451. A document giving instructions for what was to happen after the Sultan's death, called a Vasiyetname, states specific conditions for the Sultan's burial and the shape of his mausoleum. Many of these features cited in the text indeed appear in the mausoleum, suggesting that the instructions were taken seriously. What interests us here is how the text notes that the roof, that's the word that's here used to refer to the dome, should be open to the elements. As requested in the text, the dome was originally open at its apex, although the opening, as you can see on the image on the left, is now covered with glass, so that rainwater could fall onto the grave. With the open dome, the divide between interior and exterior is, if not dissolved, then certainly softened. The dome can also be seen as symbolizing the cosmos, but this basic connection is deepened with the oculus at the apex. The sky is visible, and the bounty of rain coming from above is allowed to enter and to fall on the exposed soil of the grave. So what you can't see here is that this is not a closed cenotaph, but rather it's actually open, and you can really see the soil that fills this in there. Moreover, as Carol Hillenbrand notes, in Hadith, rain is often associated with God and also with the angels. In the late 15th century, Egyptian jurist As-Suyuti, for instance, stated, quote, "Every day Gabriel is immersed in Al-Kawthar, and then he shakes himself. Every raindrop is created from an angel," end of quote. Thus, the open dome in the mausoleum of Murad II gains additional significance. The rain that is admitted is not just part of nature, but a potentially sacred element as well, with its symbolic connection to Kawthar, a body of water in paradise that has been interpreted as both pool or river. At this site, the connection is particularly strong since these are funerary buildings, which also contain further allusions to paradise. In the text, specific as it is in its description of the mausoleum, refers only to rain and not plants, but there's the question whether or not these could have blown in. A late 19th century photograph of the interior of the Gem Sultan mausoleum at the same site shows dried out plants growing on 4 cenotaphs of the same type as Murad II's. And so here you can see a bit better that these are really they're really open and filled with earth. This mausoleum dome is closed at the top, so any plants or seeds on the graves would have needed to be introduced by visitors or caretakers. What I don't know is whether this reflects a historical practice or whether it prior to the 19th century. So there's certainly some more research I need to do in that direction, which I didn't pursue when I was previously working on this site. But the connection is nevertheless tantalizing in that it seems that the exterior world and nature are invited into the building, not just with the landscapes that are present in some of the wall paintings at the site where they have been preserved, but also with the water and the plants. While the connection here, especially in a funerary context, is highly symbolic and it relates to Islamic concepts of paradise as an otherworldly realm, heavily reliant on notions of lush vegetation and abundant water, there are perhaps also more practical uses of buildings that accommodate entering water. The presence of allusion to water in such a monument directly connects to the symbolic dimension as is tied to the description of paradise in the Quran. Thus, the phrase, "gardens beneath which river flows," appears 25 times in the text, in passages that exalt the beauties of paradise. Here, too, the flowing natures of water is emphasized. The phrase, "rivers of paradise," occurs 46 times. Rivers of water, however, are not the only ones in paradise. There are also rivers of milk, of honey, and of wine. So there's certainly also other symbolic dimensions to this. The specific location of Çekirge in Bursa, the neighborhood in which the Muradia complex is located, is also the site of natural hot springs, with healing properties that are described in medical treatises. In the Ottoman period, the neighborhood was also known as Kaplıca, meaning hot spring. The provision of access to water for drinking, ritual ablutions, and personal hygiene was a central feature here, as it generally is as part of many endowments in the medieval and early Islamic world, or the modern Islamic world. Providing water for drinking, in addition to the required ablution for prayer, is thus a central feature in many architectural complexes. Thus, in the Gök Medrese in Sivas, commissioned by Sahibat Fakhreddin Ali, a high official in Anatolia under Mongol rule, a fountain built into the portal facade was used into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While here, the inscription above, right here, does not refer to the fountain specifically. In other contemporaneous buildings, detailed inscription programs address the presence of water, adding that symbolic dimension to the scheme as well. This is the case in the Sahib Akka Mosque in Konya, built for the same patron some years earlier. The Quranic inscriptions that adorn the fountains, all referring to water and springs, include references to water as one of the matters of creation and references to paradise. So this will be these two niches right here. Get closer. As Scott Redford argued, the niches probably were used to access water that was collected in the two sarcophagi built into the facade, and which also poured out from the fountain spouts below, of which only traces remain. So these, he argues that these are really still hollow, the sarcophagi, and it would have been filled, and then you can see here the hole that remains from a fountain spout would have been located. For the inscription, so I mean these two are clear. This one here has been published by Van Berchem and Co. But as they sort of like to give you the entire verse that is supposed to appear there, and then you realize that sometimes it's only part of it, and I still have not untangled everything. In part also because the inscription has been sort of facade between this photograph here and what it looks like now has been cleaned quite heavily, and so it's even harder to read now. I'm also slightly shocked that this photo is from almost 20 years ago. Oh well, pretend you didn't see that. Now, here, and we have here a symbolic an inscription program that clearly refers to the water as life-giving and tied to paradise. But there's also it's also combined with this practical fountain a function of really having the fountains integrated into the facade. Within the larger building complex, further inscriptions that refer to paradise are present in the mausoleum. It was added to the back of the mosque and renovated in the 1280s. The inscription, here in the arch, is a combination of Hadith and Quran, with passages of both pointing to the pleasures that await in paradise, and that connect directly also to the Quran inscriptions on the portal. The restoration here was completed only a few years before the patron's death in 1285, and perhaps so these changes were perhaps commissioned as the patron anticipated his passing, as he had reached a relatively advanced age at this point. Now, if we zoom out really quickly from these buildings, we also have to consider that structures like these are located in central Anatolia, hot and arid in summer, cold and wet in winter, creating a need for ways to heat them, but also to collect and store water. One particularly tantalizing example of managing or not is the Ashraf Olu Mosque in Beyşehir, built in the late 13th century by local rulers based in the city west of Konya. The building has a large opening at the center of its wooden roof, now covered in glass. So right here. And here in the cross section, it's here, and then you have just right below the opening, at the center of the prayer hall, is a large pit. It has been suggested that this served to collect snow in winter and to be preserved as ice into the summer. This ice is then supposed to have been a source of water and also a way of cooling the building during the summer. Now, I'm really still on the fence of whether or not I want to believe this argument, and also in part because it's very neat, but I also have a lot of questions about just what's going on in this building. Most also to the really, the one question is what do you do when it melts, and is your pit waterproof? But then also the bigger question of, if this was really an opening, how on earth could you have heated this building? Because even nowadays, when you're there in winter, it's absolutely freezing inside. But it just really, I'm still showing it as part of the talk, even though I haven't answered any of the questions I have about it, because it really, visiting the structure again, just really threw open a lot of these questions of, well, but how do you manage these structures? How do you manage both temperature and also water in climates with extreme variations between seasons when you have limited ways of doing that. Returning to Istanbul, we are faced with a city that is strongly marked by the presence of the sea, with the Sea of Marmara, the Bosphorus, the Golden Horn, and the Black Sea all affecting its urban space. But this is also a city that has long faced challenges in receiving enough drinking water, issues that are exacerbated in a contemporary city of over 20 million inhabitants, but that are already present in early modern sources. Thus, the Tezkire-ül Ebniye, one of 5 autobiographical texts about the 16th century Ottoman architect Sinan, contains a poem that notes, quote, "There was in Istanbul a scarcity of water. The Kırkçeşme reservoir was depleted. But again, streams were found in those regions. Orders were given for the construction of water conduits. Building arches like rainbows, we brought with them water to the city, and more than 300 fountains were built." Within the collection of Sinan's autobiographies, the attention to water also encompasses the Süleymaniye Mosque, which the architect designed, of course. Describing the fountain in the courtyard and the setting for ablutions, the Tuhfetül Memarin, another of these 5 autobiographies, states here in a mixture, actually, of poetry and prose. So it refers to the fountain at the center of the courtyard, highlighting the artistic and technical prowess of Sinan's construction, and also the work and the expertise of the stonemasons and engineers who created these features. Quote, "Subsequently, in this lofty edifice, various beautiful works of art were created, each of which took form with elegance. To begin with, in addition to the lofty flow and unique style of the courtyard fountain, in truth, spouts were placed in its 4 corners for the dispensing of water. And for ablution, 17 fountain spouts were made to flow in the buttresses on each of the 2 sides of the Noble Friday Mosque, and each of them was matchlessly furnished." End of quote. In the building's Vakfiye, as Gülür Necipoglu notes, the fountain is compared to Kauthar. Further, Evliya Çelebi in the 17th century notes that water drops down like rain, which one can imagine quite easily, even with the now restored waterworks in place. Those were replaced during the last restoration, as the originals weren't working anymore. The water taps on the side of the building's lateral facades still work today and are indeed used for ablutions. Not described in Sinan's autobiographies, but certainly worth of similar attention, are water devices in the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, one of Sinan's late designs. Here, a shadirvan that also features taps for ablutions is in the center of the courtyard. And here, the video will sort of give you a sense of the soundscape that is created in the courtyard. I recorded it at night because during the day it's often very crowded, and sort of the crowds tend to drown out the sound. In the building's interior, we find a further water device that unfortunately no longer works, a fountain placed right here under the Miesenmachfili. It's over the only study of this that I've been able to track down. Günkut Akın argues that the pool was intended for drinking and otherwise suggests that the central location in the prayer hall was covered by symbolic rather than practical concerns. Not considered in this analysis is the acoustic potential of such a fountain. Placed underneath the platform for which the call to prayers would be chanted just before the start of prayers, and from where the muezzin recited responses to the imam's prayer, could the water have affected the building's soundscape? And there's really also a question here of scale, so maybe this was not big enough, but it's something I'm interested in exploring further. How sound affects the perception of an interior space appears very clearly in the hospital that is part of the mosque complex of Bayezid II, a late 15th century building also located in Edirne. Here, the sound of the fountain at the center of a domed interior courtyard spreads across the building. The presence of the fountain in this medical institution points to the notion that the sound of water has healing power. Water here is part of a holistic approach to human well-being in which body and mind both can benefit from the use and presence of water. In hot springs, in hammams, and through the soundscape it creates. Water, more than just a practical solution to thirst and hygiene, is thus also imbued with powers that evoke a multisensory response, harnessed through architecture. The presence of water, both indoors and outdoors, brings us back to Topkapi Palace, a site full of water features, indoors and outdoors ones, and also surrounded by and with full views of the sea, as this late 15th century poem notes, which emphasizes the palace's elevated location above the sea and also the views that it provides. I mean, minus the urban sprawl of Istanbul today. And here is the this fountain in action, which still sort of where I have lots of questions about. Again, sort of this, the soundscape it creates outdoors and also how its water relates to the sea around. You may hear Quran recitation in the background that has nothing to do with the fountain. That comes from the treasury of sacred objects where the Quran is recited permanently. So, but I mean, it just it comes in here because it's very close and very loud. Such attention to the multisensory in connecting architecture to the environment also appears in a final example I would like to discuss today. In the Mirador de Lindaraja, the 14th century belvedere in the Alhambra, The Palace of the Nasrid Rulers of Granada, a poem quite explicitly addresses the relationship between the building, nature, and the human viewer. As D. Fairchild Ruggles notes, the view from the Mirador was opened before the addition of in the 16th century of the buildings that now obstruct the lines of sight. So here you really have to imagine a view on surrounding landscapes. The poem particularly emphasizes the elevated viewpoint from the structure, and thus a perspective on the surrounding landscape that is no longer visible. In evoking also, in addition to all these references to vision and to the Sultan dominating the landscape by way of his gaze, in evoking, in addition to these, the breeze flowing through the space, the environment and climate become part by way of haptic evocation of the visual context that the poem creates. Regulating climate and navigating both symbolic and practical relationships to nature, the God's creation in the Islamic religious universe, were central questions in designing eco-architecture and its uses in the pre-modern Islamic world. With these questions, then, I will move into larger context of how architecture reacts to climate, especially in interiors created to shield humans from the elements, and also questions how architecture serves to provide water for human use. In the appreciation of the notion of wonder that is underlying in also much of the poetry that talks about water, and which is actively sought in engagement with nature, such building practices also tie back to the ways in which wonder is evoked through spaces, objects, and poetry. Wonder, as Travis Zadeh shows in his recent study of Qazvini's 13th century wonder of creation and its reception until the 19th century, is an effect of marveling at nature and the world at large, the cosmos and things made by humans, and those created by nature, in a constant state of seeking knowledge. Architecture, the artifice it creates, and also the quest of how to redesign and build it in relationship to nature is part of this process. Thank you.
You want to take your own questions, or should I do that?
How about you do that, because I don't know everyone.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Patricia. That was fantastic and so lovely to see some of the fresh kind of primary sources and work that you're doing for the new book project. I guess I have two questions, and the first one, I'm channeling my predecessor, James Westcott, a little bit, and perhaps this is a question he would have asked, which is when you're on site and you're doing these recordings, you know, both paying attention to sound, but also sort of movement of water, how do you as a historian sort of think about the current perhaps engineering and environmental context of how those water functions or features function, as opposed to how they might have functioned? Because from what I understand of an eco-critical approach in art history, it's a sort of combination of visual analysis, cultural interpretation, and environmental history. So how do you balance that historical shifts in the environment when you're doing this kind of analysis? And I think it's a question that might be useful for our students as well. So.
No, thank you. And I mean, that's a question that's sort of present throughout, right? Not just with regard to the buildings, but also with regard to the surrounding landscapes, because so much of that has been transformed. Much of it very recently, in the sense of late 19th century and later. And so that's true for it's true for all the bodies of water, right? The way they're being used, the way rivers have been changed, their flow has been changed by dams or by sort of engineering their flow to be more efficient. The way, I mean, this is sort of very swampy here under the bridge, but this used to be a big river, so it probably didn't look like that. And there's sort of questions of marshlands that are disappearing, like the ones that you've, of course, worked on. In addition to also the engineering features that are often not original, like so this fountain, for instance, in the Süleymaniye, actually in Guru Hoca's article from 1995 or so, it says it's not working. And it was restored very recently in the last restoration that took place, that finished around 2015, right? And what I'm still having a hard time, I think, is reconciling, the knowledge that a lot of these things would not have looked like this, would not have sounded like this originally, with the fact that the visuals I can give you are the ones that reflect what it looks like today. And because they're not necessarily historical representations of a lot of these features or a lot of these sites, or if they exist, they don't show what I want to show. And I do think that better understanding the original engineering, which I really don't understand Ottoman and earlier water engineering well enough yet, might be helpful to just say, look, here's the technology, here's how this worked. If you still see it working today, it's working because there's mechanical pumps and wall at work, but it would have functioned and it could have done something maybe like this, maybe much gentler, because the water pressure would have been much lower, right? Because this is like this. If it looks like a shower head in a fancy hotel, it's because that's the rate at which the water is coming out of it, right? But if Elia Çelebi talks about rain, that's maybe much gentler, unless it's a crazy stormy downpour. So I'm hoping that is sort of going to be an inroads.
Oh, yeah. First, I was just going to reflect on that question, which I think is so interesting. And I'm sure you mentioned D.R. Ruggles. I'm sure you know this article, but I just think methodologically the way she's dealt with changeover time at the courtyards of the Alhambra and so forth, and looking at 19th century photos and so on is interesting, because it just it's not exactly the same as these engineering problems, but it makes us very conscious of what are the assumptions that we're making, and how did previous conservators make different assumptions and so forth. But my question was another one. Throughout your lecture, it was a very evocative lecture, and throughout I kept thinking of ancient Roman examples of this or that. But the one that specifically was so obvious that I'm sure you've considered was the Bursa. I think it was the very first example you gave, the Bursa. I guess it's a mausoleum complex, and for Mehmed II. And so, quite obviously the oculus that allows rain to come in. It seems like impossible that there was no knowledge of the pantheon in that, but maybe it is possible. So I just wondered how you thought about. And in general, of course, there are many. The Romans were great at collecting water and letting water in, and so on and so forth. So I just wondered how you thought about that issue of the kind of either continuous kind of Mediterranean and ancient tradition that certainly the Ottomans would have known quite well. And how you kind of balance thinking about innovation versus a kind of reference to that tradition. Thank you.
No, thank you. And definitely agreed on the historiography, right, and the 19th century photographs and what they can give us. They give us a snapshot of the 19th century sometimes, but at least it's sort of a helpful corrective to what we can encounter in the present day. In terms of the question of continuity and on innovation. I think one, it's that's very strong in two things. One is water infrastructure along the lines of aqueducts, in the sense that, of course, in Istanbul, the Ottomans, they still use Byzantine aqueducts. The aqueduct of Valens is still standing right there from the 4th century. And then they build things that are exactly like it, but the engineering becomes more sophisticated as they build on, and they come up with other ways of storing water and of pumping it and these kind of things. The other part where it's, I think, very relevant is the question of like bathhouses, of hammams, and that technology, right? And that's I know that's quite simply absent of the talk, because I basically ran out of time as I was preparing for it, and it's really I think one of the questions to the because that sort of that's a place where like the engineering and natural water supply, but then also questions of like of hygiene and of sensory experience come together, and it's really sort of inescapable to look at that somewhere. And there's of course work that goes into that. For instance, Nina Makarak's really wonderful book on the Chamberlain Tash Hammam, sort of a biography of one building, but where she also considers some of these like really questions of how the buildings were perceived by those who used them, and how they were set up for that by those who built them. And so there's definitely sort of a lot to go on, just in terms of where all of this is taking place too.
Thank you so much for the lecture. I had a question about, I guess, sort of binaries that you're setting up. You had opened your lecture with a comment about how a courtyard is a liminal space. And you've talked a lot about bringing nature into the city, into interiors, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, I guess, the binaries you're setting up. Is it urban versus nature? Is it interior versus exterior? And then sort of what are the roles of these different architectural spaces in constructing those binaries? For me, when I think of a courtyard as like inherently interior, not at all liminal, especially I'm thinking of like Ottoman Syria, but how it is actually in the interior and not on a sort of threshold, and what that means for bringing nature into somewhere, and perhaps the kind of binary that then creates between what is urban and probably a very dirty medieval city that's like pretty gross and like not at all pleasant to be in, and then creating those kinds of interior spaces that evoke a nature that is somehow beyond the city. So I was wondering what kinds of, I guess, binaries you're constructing.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm definitely hoping to not create the binary between urban versus nature, in the sense that I think that's where the water question comes in, because it's so present, even though engineered. So I'm sort of trying to tie from there to nature, and then tie from just something I have to work out, actually. Also, the relationship between the water that's being managed and then the water that's just there, right? So what about it's in sort of this this topography, right? You have all these bodies of water around you, and you can't even see all of them in this picture, that are that the city is subject to in its climate. Forget all the bridges; none of these existed in any time prior to the 19th century. Some even the 21st century. And then the water that's being brought in and that's being used in the building and that's being harnessed for human use, right? So I think that's something I haven't figured out yet at all, and whether or not this. So whether a sense of that there's water you can't manage maybe also drives the desire to manage the water that you can. Like you can gather rainwater up to a point, unless you have a flood, and you can bring water from springs in the hinterland, but maybe you can't so much manage the sea that's around it. The courtyards, I mean, that's for me. That's kind of to me sort of something where the answer is it depends. Maybe also what kind of courtyard we're talking about, right? Whether we're talking about what maybe you're referring to a courtyard in a house. That is very much so. Like I'm thinking of these 18th century Syrian houses where that courtyard is part of a domestic interior that we're already getting into that courtyard. Has limited access, sort of means you're part of in a way, the household. And there's something like a mosque courtyard, which, they all have, and again, some of this is, I think some of the mosque courtyard stuff is also quite specifically Ottoman, maybe, in the sense that these are, you can walk through these. They all have multiple entrances. Usually at least 3, sometimes more, you can walk through. They are part of the mosque, but not quite of the mosque. So they're not interior, but they are also a step removed from the city, from what's around, from sort of the immediate urban environment, maybe. And so like the interior versus exterior is one of the questions really that I'm also thinking about. Okay, so how do I treat the space like this, right? Where do I put this? Or is the binary indeed, the interior-exterior binary here really tripping me up? And I mean, your question suggests that it certainly is. That there's something else maybe, where some courtyards can certainly be treated as interiors, but then some are something else. Does that make them exterior? Well, maybe. Maybe I'm just making it too complicated, I'm not sure.
Thank you so much. I've been really struck by the symbolic dimension of the work, and particularly with the Sulaimaniya mosque. The ceiling had this interpretation of rain falling from the sky. And I've been thinking about domes and how there's more of a cosmic connotation. And I'm wondering if, like, with these symbolic shifts in the covering, is there symbolic change to the fountains or not?
Well, I mean, here I think so this is in some ways it's kind of a really specific case where that rain connection is being made for a fountain that is kind of closed off in itself, and whereas if Evliya Çelebi comes up with that connection, what I think is maybe more. And sort of, there's sort of not really another example like this that I can point you to and sort of say, oh well, but here is how it works. I think what I'm more, where I'm sort of more, where sort of the symbolic aspect of that, the combination of dome and rain, is more present is this side where you have the funerary context. And this is really one of the examples where there's really a text that's roughly contemporary to the building that really talks about and says, look, this is done in this particular way. How well that functions, I don't know, because this can't be opened, and B, even if it could, I mean, I would not necessarily advocate opening that during a rainstorm and see what happens to the building below. But I think here this is really sort of one place where that connection is very specifically made and talked about, and where then, there's perhaps the question, so then is the dome the cosmological symbol, or is it a vehicle to channel that view of the cosmos and sort of that way of saying, well, there's sort of rain as a divine bounty is here just like highlighted? Because of course you could also just like not have a dome, right? And yet, and maybe this is just the Ottomans being obsessed with domes, so they really want the dome, and then come up with a solution of, oh, but I want this dome, and but I also want the rain, and it also. So how about this? There's actually an article about it's in Turkish. It's about the 17th century, about like the 17th century open mausolea in the Ottoman context, where it kind of goes in that direction. It's actually they don't have domes, and it basically looks like they're much smaller than this, but then it looks like a little column enclosure, and the top is open, and then it kind of engages with that discourse of, oh, but you should let the rain in, and sort of have that have the cosmological aspect without the device of the dome tied to it. I can, if you, Google me, email me, and I'll send it to you, and then you can see what the because I don't remember the specific examples right now, but you can see them.
Any more questions?
So it was really great, Patricia, just to see how this book project is building off of your previous work. Specifically, I'm thinking about your compilation with Rachel Gashgarian on the production of space. And I think Nasser knows when I mention the Oculus, what I'm going to compare it to is that, when I think of the Oculus and this dome, I think immediately of Armenian churches. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking about Gegard, about Goshavang, how they similarly have this Oculus that would have been open to the elements. And Ani as well, there's an Oculus, but it's within the wall. And it's a bit off kilter. It's not central, but there's something about it that the way that it controls the entrance of light into the sanctuary is really interesting. So, I think one question I have is, looking at the collection of rainwater, this, permittance of the elements, if looking at what's happening in, thinking about, the Armenian connection within the Seljuk Empire, and thinking about how is, perhaps looking at the comparative use of the Oculus in that practice, but then also, with your colleague over, when you think about archaeoacoustics, the first person you think about is, at least for me, is Bisera Pincheva. Multi-sensory aesthetics of the Hagia Sophia can never forget. But thinking, in your preliminary, investigation so far, have you seen that there is a connection to the materiality in relation to the construction of these water fountains? That, the depth of it, the density, is it ceramic, is it marble, and how is that conducive, to having that sonar quality?
No, thank you. Several great questions. I probably won't completely answer all of them, but so in terms of the material, pretty much everything is marble. A lot of it is marble. So really, or other types of stone, but I think the marble water connection, which of course is also a Roman thing, it's also a Byzantine thing. It appears in some of Bisera's work, and there's Marcus Milwright has written about it more specifically with regard to Islamic sources. So that's definitely there. And the soundscapes, that's something where I just have to think about how to explore them, and maybe some of that can just be done with really good because now the videos I showed you are completely unedited, right? This is just like the lazy cell phone footage I have, so maybe more. And one could obviously filter out some of the background noise and like the screaming tourists and the annoying Oriental music in the background to maybe give a better sense of what's going on. In terms of the Oculus, didn't. I mean, this is one thing I was sort of on the fence about building into the talk. So they're more straightforward Seljuk like examples that are really like the big dome with the big hole at the top. So that maybe the detour to the sort of Zuge garden and these kind of things is not necessarily needed here. Although I mean it has given me something to think about. Thank you. So especially in terms of lighting also, right? Because those are definitely connected. So the Karatai Madrasa has this really gigantic opening at the top. It also has a big water basin underneath, which has and this is this is unfortunately a really bad photo, so I'll have to either find better one to go back. What this is a water channel that was excavated. That what's not clear is what is not clear about is if this was taking water out of the basin or into the basin. Unfortunately, I've seen publications of the excavation, but they were not able to figure that quite out. And this is not the only Seljuk example. There's at least just in Konya, there's another two that have this kind of dome and then some sort of way of receiving water underneath. What I don't have, and which is also why it's sort of not it's not in the talk at this stage. Any like contemporary sources that talk about this, right? So this is here the basin. What the basin looks like. Then there's this like little. Is this a fountain spout? What is this? This is probably this may be late. And there's an Ottoman addition somewhere, so showing that this was used for a long time. But how was it used? Is really not clear. And this is since we're on this is another one. So this too, the Inji Minaral, you can't see it, but it has the same kind of opening at the top of the dome. Again, over a basin that you can't really see because it's sort of hidden behind these museum cases, and then similar like a channel for water. So this seems to be a thing in Seljuk/Mongol Anatolia, and I'm sort of revisiting a lot of these buildings that are in my first book. With questions that I was just like, okay, I can tell you everything about the patronage and about like everything else about this building, but I've got no clue how these water features work in them. And so far, as to the extent I found so far, no one else does either. So there's really a big question mark what is going on here.
I have two questions, actually. I mean, one question and the other is sort of like still not very well formulated. But the question is that it's very difficult nowadays for us to appreciate the limitation on the production of anything, actually, in the pre-modern period. We're used to this sort of like huge amount of water being piped into our life at all time. And I'm wondering if the scarcity of water is not what we should look at in here. And the fact that most of this architecture is extremely difficult to produce in order to ultimately get very little water. I worked on an aqueduct at some point, the one that brought the water to the citadel of Cairo, for example. And it's an amazing engineering work, 3 kilometers of all of these arches bringing water from the River Nile to basically a section of like 12 centimeter by about 20 centimeter. This is the amount of water that was being brought for the use of something like 20,000 people that lived in that citadel. So we need to somehow restrict our expectations over this water, and that's why my comment about the restoration is that they are distorting our view. fountains in Islamic history are very dainty, very slender. The water is actually used to a maximum. And I'm very glad that you showed us the soundscape of it, because really the sound of water is part of those architecture of sort of like producing very, very little spigots, very little way of getting the water out and maximizing the sound of that water in those hot regions. But my real question is about the interplay between three factors in your lecture. And that is, first is the references, the traditions that those architecture are coming from. The Ottomans in particular, but also the Seljuk. I mean, we are overlooking in here that they're coming more from the eastern part of the Islamic world, where water is more scarce, and where the architecture of water was something that was a little bit more controlled, a little bit more tightly controlled. Canalization underground to not to lose so much water, and the little water that was being brought. So I appreciate Cami's comment on the Roman tradition, but it's not enough for us to understand the use of water in here. So that's one aspect, is actually who do we refer to as sort of like the tradition? Armenian, Roman, Persian, Mesopotamian, whatever. And actually I'm thinking also of the Ayyubid fountains, which are very similar to the same that is happening in all of these small dynasties in Anatolia. They are all working like this one that we have on the picture, on very little water and maximizing that little water. The second factor is the symbology of the Quran, which is actually extremely flexible. It allows reading of different ways. So you could actually have the verse about the paradise without really meaning it. And I'm saying that because I'm actually losing my faith in a way in the possibility of reading specific symbols in the use of verses. There's a little bit of repetition and sort of like generic use of some verses. But the third is the fact that we tend to think of Islamic architecture as sort of like a unit. And your presentation reminded me that we are dealing with different climates. And you're showing us water in the part of the Islamic world, which of course actually in comparison to Scandinavia is nothing, but is where water is abundant. I'm actually imagining the rest of the Islamic world where water is way, way, way less available. And whether this is washing over the Ottoman architecture that we're seeing here, that is whether they are somehow restrained because of the weight of tradition when they have more water, or is there an interplay between the three that would allow you to read different uses of water as they adjust these three factors? The tradition that they are based on, the climate, the actual climate, are they responding to a specific climate? And in this case, for example, those covered domes over courtyards, we were taught when I was a student that they were because Anatolia is colder, and therefore an open courtyard is not advisable.
That one is still around, I know.
Yes. So anyway, I'm wondering if you have any comment on the possibility of using the three in order to perhaps nuance the line of argument about water here.
No, definitely. Thank you. And I mean, it's true, right? That sort of there's so much in here that is really specific to these places and these geographies and the climate that they come, the climates that they come with. Right. This. Where are you? This here, I actually the photo with the Bursa in the snow. I tried to talk my editor into using this as the cover for my book on Ottoman architecture. She hated it, and I'm really glad she did, because it's so much better if I can use it for this current project now. So I'm really glad she vetoed that, although I was really mad of it at the time. But what it shows is that, right, this is something that's not relevant even in, say, a place like Kashan in Iran, which is an oasis in a desert. All the water supply that city, its bathhouses, its fountains, and its gardens come through qanats, through underground channels. I guess it's the only way to get it there. And so they're dealing, this architecture that I show you here is responding to very different challenges. It's responding to the fact that it can be very cold, but also very hot. It's responding to the fact that sometimes you end up with not having enough water, but a lot of time you actually end up getting lots and lots of water. Hence, there's a good reason all the Constantinople / Istanbul is full of cisterns, and they continue to be used for centuries. And so there's, I think there's, in some ways, in the, thinking about the question of sort of tradition and how it might affect what you do, the sort of the sense that in a lot of what's happening in Anatolia, there is some restraint, but maybe much less than there would be elsewhere, because water is really, it is available to a greater degree, and it's something where you can end up having too much of it. You can end up having a surplus. You do get floods. You do get storms, and then you have to sort of and there's accounts of like how they're having to deal with that, right? Sort of floods sweeping away bridges and these kind of things. And so maybe there is, sort of in this engineering that creates, again, soundscapes that would have been, like Nasser said, dainty, and not what they're not. This really, today it's quite loud. I don't have a video of this one, but it's really that's not what Evliya Çelebi describes, and say what you want about Evliya Çelebi, he makes up a lot of things, but he's also a very good observer. And so if he says it's like rain, then I tend to believe him more than restoration circa 2015 that could not go on, that was based on something that had not been working maybe for centuries, right? That was not trying to fix something that was kind of still working. It was really not functional. And so there's maybe, I think, something that like really a question that I really have to think about, right? Is what is sort of expected attitudes towards water, and then what is actually practical in the place where this is, and the architecture that is there, and where then does the sort of expectation / water ideally is something, that's scarce, therefore carefully managed, and if you manage it carefully, you get a specific aesthetic, both of the trickling, both in its sound, but also what it looks like, right? Sort of, if you think about Shadirwans and how the water sort of flows down very gently, and that sort of gives you a specific pattern of sound and of what it looks like. And that is also still, that kind of thing is harnessed even in Topkapi Palace. There's actually, I don't have the photo, but maybe I do. In here, if you go, where did my cursor go? Here, if you go, so this platform, and behind it, there is actually a fountain that really has a Shadirwan built into it. So these kind of things, they come back up. And ultimately, I think, the long-mindedness of the answer also shows that really, this question of water in Islamic architecture is really a too big one, because it's not one thing, right? It's so specific, and so maybe looking at very specific examples in very specific contexts or in a specific geography, and say, look at, you know, the 12th to the 16th century, then kind of put the finger on what there is that is maybe general and what there is that is specific, but also really the fact to the extent to which so much of this is geographically specific.
I guess, thank you.
Yep.